Or is it okay like this? Check, check, check. Hello, hello, hello. Or is it okay like this? Check, check, check. Hello, hello, hello. Dun 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 dun.
Contrary to the common Iranian filmmakers who pick out in their movies the Iranian government and jurisdiction, as well as social problems as central themes, and so gaining recognition in European and American film festivals, Andy Digger, the Swiss-Iranian screenwriter, photographer and filmmaker, who spent more than half of his life in Europe and knowing intensively the negative and positive sides of both social systems, is examining the European society carefully and with keen eye.
My name is Andy Digger, and I am a Swiss-Iranian screenwriter, photographer, and filmmaker. The title of my film today is Think Twice, and it can be assumed that I will make myself unpopular with some. However, it is in no way my intention to offend any group, person, or creed, or to hurt their feelings and beliefs. This film is based on research, facts, and already published documents, most of which were unknown to you until now. Your outlook on life and perspective will change fundamentally afterwards. Basically, many adherents of heroes, human figure or country, don't have detailed knowledge about their heroes, their true life, and their past. People are always looking for myths and idols. They do not want to admit that their idols are not what they represent and what people want to see. Today you will experience what connections, or in other words, what similarities and parallels exist between the slave trade, neutral Switzerland, and the creation of some Swiss banks, Che Guevara with Irish roots and multimillionaire Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, or Adolf Hitler and the Iranian government leader Ayatollah Khomeini with Indian roots, and Ayatollah Khamenei with Iraqi roots, as well as Napoleon with Turkish President Erdogan. I did not choose these topics by chance, but I was always involuntarily, directly or indirectly confronted with these topics and sometimes had extremely bitter experiences. Relationships between the slave trade, neutral Switzerland, and the emergence of some Swiss banks. Switzerland, with its more than 700 years of history, is not only known for its chocolate and watches, but also for its neutrality, humanitarian operations, direct democracy, the banks, and their importance in the global economy. But what does such a country have to do with the slave trade of black Africans from Africa, and what is the connection between the slave trade of black Africans and the emergence of some Swiss banks? It is true that there were many taboo topics in Switzerland that took a long time to become the object of historical research. The issue of slavery and Swiss participation is one of these major issues. It really needed the political impetus of the rise of this question. There are also some events and experiences in my life in Switzerland that motivate me to pursue this question. I wish there was a constitutional amendment regarding the word black and everything associated with it, especially in expressions, images, and human encounters. These are expressions or images in a negative sense, such as black sheep, depicted on posters to deport criminal foreigners from Switzerland, although many of these undisputedly criminal foreigners are fair-skinned and blonde. Black hands shown on Swiss passports to represent an election campaign against easier naturalization in Switzerland. Black money for untaxed money or money from illegal sources. Fare evasion for journeys without a ticket or on public transport. Chocolate product called, for example, Mohrenkopf because black servants had been called Moors. And blacklist. I had to witness some sad moments in everyday life in connection with a uniquely hidden racist behavior of a very small minority in Switzerland towards people with darker skin color. For example, in the supermarket, surveillance and persecution by employees behind darker-skinned people through eye contact and suspicion of theft, although blonde, fair-skinned foreign criminals in the same supermarket were not persecuted in this way. Conversations with darker-skinned foreigners who were used as sex machines out of financial need to bring a breath of fresh air into a boring marriage, with certainty in the background that they would be deported anyway and nobody would get to know about it. Talks with darker-skinned foreigners about their experiences with some elderly retired Swiss who have been insulted about why they would not work, and nobody was interested to know in their national language skills or whether they had a working permit at all. I knew about the background of the fears of some elderly people, government employees and especially retired bank employees with high wages and pensions, that their future pension would depend on the younger generation working and payments into the pension fund. Today, due to international pressure on Switzerland, and because of publications and research by Swiss historians, it has become known that Switzerland was involved in the logistics of slavery. Slaves were captured in Africa in a complex system and brought overseas to the New World. This required financial resources, ships, shipping companies, insurance companies, ship crews, so a large infrastructure was required. The industrialization of Europe was also largely based on slavery. The slave trade was an international business in global trade with Swiss participation. Although Switzerland was not a colonial power, the Swiss were not different from their Dutch, French, English, or German counterparts, and, like these other Europeans, tried to profit from slave labor. On the plantations overseas, the slaves had to produce colonial goods which were shipped back again, and therefore merchants were required. The Swiss Confederates were involved in these complex systems, whether in the slave trade or in financing plantations. However, Switzerland never saw itself as a colonial power and was only partially involved in the system of slavery. As far as Swiss companies are concerned, the textile industry was an important customer for American cotton. The production of the Indian textiles, these were high-quality materials as barter goods, was only possible due to the existing system. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, some 11 to 12 million slaves were chained in Africa and jammed into ships where many died under inhuman conditions, sailing across the Atlantic to America to be forced into labor. The slave trade was organized by Europeans in the form of a triangular trade. First, ships from European Atlantic ports left Liverpool, Genoa, Nantes, and Marseille. They were loaded with goods which were exchanged for slaves on the west coast of Africa. Second, the slave ships then left for America, on the way landing at the Antilles and the Caribbean islands where slaves were sold. Third, there the ships were loaded with raw materials such as cotton, sugar, and coffee to bring back to Europe. Products imported from East India to Africa were processed in Europe into high-quality products like textiles, and then exported to West Africa from European countries. France banished the non-Catholic Huguenots who had the know-how for the production of Indian fabrics. Thousands of Huguenots subsequently fled to Switzerland and Germany. About 70 years later, France repealed the ban on Huguenots, and Basel and Neuchâtel entrepreneurs became involved in the slave trade across the Atlantic port of Nantes. Private bankers then took over financing the shipping transportation. 80 to 90% of Indian fabrics were produced in Switzerland, and Swiss businessmen not only had fabrics for trade produced, but also brought together the financial means to pay for the shipping. They founded financial companies, which later became one or the other banking institution. This trade generated profits that were invested in private property. Some of these banking families participated in the slave trade. Participation in the slave trade also made it possible to participate in transatlantic trade and thereby build up a global trade network. This network was certainly positive in establishing Swiss private banks in the 18th century. The sales of the goods created a huge amount of capital. Enslavement of Africans was highly profitable and had become a major economic factor. In 1807, Great Britain banned the slave trade, but it wasn't over yet. Even countries such as Switzerland, which were not considered a colonial power, were still involved in these black transactions. In 1815, during the Congress of Vienna, slavery was condemned and Britain tried to enforce treaties for the abolition of slavery with other countries. In 1861, the Federal Council of Switzerland was called upon to ban slavery in Brazil. There was no ban, it was defended. In 2001 in South Africa, during the Third World Conference Against Racism, in the so-called Durban Declaration, the slave trade is declared a crime against humanity. Jean-Daniel Vigny, the Swiss representative, emphasized that Switzerland was not affected by compensation claims made by the African side against those who had benefited from slavery. 2 years later, in 2003, various politicians called on the Swiss National Council, and it was no longer denied that official Switzerland was involved in the slave trade. However, official Switzerland accepts no responsibility for this, as it only concerned individuals or business people who had got their hands dirty. Discussions on this taboo topic were triggered for the first time in 2003. So, my dear friends, as you have seen, the world and life are not a request concert. No matter where you geographically live, you will always have to deal with countries and people who disguise an important and dark chapter of themselves. And this was the common denominator for everyone described here. I once read somewhere that 3 steps are necessary to destroy a culture. Destroying the place of honor of the woman in the family. Destroying the place of honor of teachers in the education system. Destroying historical legends and replacing them with new role models and heroes. This is my message and request to you. Think twice about which decisions you make. Consider twice which heroes and legends are suggested to you as role models. Think twice about the ways legends are artificially created. Think twice about what you are committed to.